The Virginia dawn broke red over the tobacco fields, painting the plantation in shades of blood and copper. It was 1703, and the air already hung thick with heat and the promise of violence. In the quarters, where wooden shacks leaned against each other like exhausted prisoners, a giant of a man stood motionless, watching the sun climb. Ezekiel had been forged in fire. 28 years old, standing nearly 7 feet tall, his body was a map of scars, each one a memory, each one a lesson. His back bore the crisscross pattern of countless whippings. His hands, massive and calloused, had known the feel of iron chains more than human touch. But it was his eyes that unsettled people most. Dark, calculating, and utterly void of fear. He hadn't always been this way. There had been a time, years ago, when he'd been called something else. A name from across the ocean, from a village he could barely remember. But that boy had died the day he watched his mother collapse in the fields, worked to death while the overseer laughed. That boy had died again when they sold his sister south, her screams echoing as the wagon pulled away. That boy had died 1,000 small deaths until only Ezekiel remained, hard as iron, cold as stone. The plantation belonged to Edmund Hartwell, a man whose cruelty was legendary even among Virginia's planter class. Hartwell believed in breaking spirits early and often. He employed 3 overseers, brutal men who took pleasure in their work. The worst was Jacob Pike, a wiry man with pale eyes and a bullwhip he'd named Mercy, because he claimed it was the only mercy slaves would ever receive. On this particular morning, Pike was in a foul mood. A slave named Thomas had collapsed the day before, unable to continue working. Pike had made an example of him, dragging the sick man to the punishment post and delivering 20 lashes while the others watched. Thomas hadn't survived the night. "You," Pike's voice cut through the morning air, directed at Ezekiel. "You think you're special, don't you, standing there like some kind of king?" Ezekiel didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that silence was its own form of resistance, but Pike wanted a reaction. He always did. "I asked you a question, boy." Pike stepped closer, the bullwhip coiled in his hand. Still, Ezekiel said nothing. His face remained impassive, but inside something was shifting. Thomas had been his friend, one of the few men in the quarters who still remembered how to smile. Now he was gone, just another body to be buried in the unmarked graves beyond the tree line. Pike raised the whip. What happened next would be talked about in whispers for years. Ezekiel moved with a speed that shouldn't have been possible for a man his size. His hand shot out, catching the whip mid-swing. For a moment, Pike's expression shifted from anger to something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You best think real careful about what you do next," Pike hissed, trying to pull the whip free. Ezekiel held it firm. Around them, the other slaves had stopped moving. The entire plantation seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, deliberately, Ezekiel released the whip and stepped back. "Smart," Pike said, though his voice shook slightly. "Real smart." But as Pike walked away, shouting orders to get everyone to the fields, Ezekiel made a decision. It crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. He would no longer be a victim. He would no longer watch people he cared about die. He would become something else, something necessary. That night, in the darkness of the quarters, an old woman named Mama Esther found him sitting alone. She was ancient, her face lined with decades of suffering, but her mind remained sharp. "I seen that look before," she said quietly, settling beside him. "That look in your eyes, you planning something." Ezekiel glanced at her. Thomas deserved better. They all deserve better. Mama Esther's voice was barely a whisper. But wanting and doing are different things. What if they weren't? She studied him for a long moment. "There are stories," she finally said. "Stories from other plantations. Stories about slaves who disappeared into the night and never came back. Not because they were caught, but because someone helped them vanish. Who? Ghosts, some say. Others say it's people who know the swamps, who know the paths through the wilderness. She paused. People brave enough or crazy enough to fight back. Ezekiel leaned forward. How do I find these people? You don't find them, they find you. Mama Esther stood slowly. But if you're serious, if you're truly ready to walk this path, there's an old oak tree 3 miles north, where the creek splits. Go there tomorrow night, alone. Wait. And then? Then you'll see if the stories are true. The next evening, after the day's brutal work ended, Ezekiel waited until the quarters grew quiet. The moon hung low and full, providing just enough light to navigate by. He moved through the shadows like water, avoiding the patrollers who circled the plantation boundaries with dogs and guns. The forest was alive with night sounds, crickets, owls, the distant howl of something wild. Ezekiel moved deeper into the darkness, his senses alert. He'd been in these woods before, always running, always hiding. But tonight felt different. Tonight he was hunting for something. The old oak stood exactly where Mama Esther had described, massive and gnarled, its branches spreading like fingers against the stars. The creek gurgled nearby, split into 2 channels by a moss-covered stone. Ezekiel positioned himself beneath the tree and waited. An hour passed, then another. He was beginning to think the old woman had been telling stories when he heard it, a low whistle, almost like a bird call, but not quite. He froze, every muscle tensed. "You've got courage, I'll give you that." The voice came from the darkness, followed by a figure emerging from the shadows. A black man, perhaps 50 years old, lean and hard-muscled, with knowing eyes. "Mama Esther sent word you might come." "Who are you?" "Names don't matter much in this work, but you can call me Moses." The man smiled slightly at Ezekiel's reaction. "Not the Moses from the Bible, though I do my share of leading people out of bondage." "You're real, then?" "The stories are real. Real as the scars on your back." Moses circled slowly, assessing Ezekiel with a practiced eye. "The question is, are you real? Are you truly ready for what this means?" "I'm ready." "You say that now. But this path, once you step onto it, there's no turning back. The hunters will come for you. The dogs will track you. Every white man in Virginia will want your head on a pike." Moses stepped closer. "And you'll have to do things, terrible things, to protect the people you're saving. Can you live with that?" Ezekiel thought of Thomas, of his mother, of his sister, of every person he'd watched suffer and die under the weight of chains. "I can live with anything except doing nothing." Moses studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Then your education begins tonight. But first, you need to understand something. The brutality they call you, the violence they fear in you, that's going to become your weapon. You're going to have to be harder than them, meaner than them, more ruthless than they ever imagined. Because every time you spare someone who would hunt us, you're putting innocent lives at risk. I understand. Do you? Because once you start down this road, you become the monster they always said you were, except you'll be a monster with a purpose." Moses gestured toward the deeper woods. "Come, there's much to learn and little time to learn it." As they disappeared into the forest, Ezekiel felt something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. The man who had been broken and beaten, the man who had endured everything Virginia's cruelty could throw at him, was about to become something new. He was about to become a legend. If you want to discover what happens next, don't forget to like and follow the channel so you don't miss the upcoming chapters. The education of Ezekiel took place in the hidden corners of Virginia, places the planters never ventured, spaces carved out by necessity and desperation. Moses led him through a world that existed in the margins, where enslaved people had built an invisible nation right under their masters' noses. "The great dismal swamp," Moses explained as they waded through chest-deep water 3 nights later. "They say it's haunted. They say people who go in never come out. They're half right," he grinned. "People go in and never come out. At least not where anyone's looking." The swamp was a revelation. Within its tangled vegetation and murky waters existed entire communities of escaped slaves, men and women who'd built homes in the most inhospitable terrain imaginable, precisely because no white man would follow them there. Children played in the shallows while adults tended small gardens on patches of solid ground. It was a glimpse of freedom, fragile and fierce. "This is one of 3 hidden settlements," Moses said. Places where people can rest, heal, and prepare for the next leg of their journey north. But getting people here, that's the hard part. Over the following weeks, Ezekiel learned the intricate network that Moses and others had created. There were safe houses on the edges of plantations, run by brave souls, both black and the rare sympathetic white person who risked everything to shelter runaways. There were coded messages passed through songs, patterns in quilts, marks on trees that only the trained eye could read. "The North Star," Moses said one night, pointing up. "That's their guide once they're away from us. But first, they need to get away. That's where you come in." Ezekiel's role crystallized quickly. His size, his strength, and his intimate knowledge of Hartwell's plantation made him perfect for the most dangerous work, the actual extraction of people ready to run. But Moses taught him that strength alone wasn't enough. You need to be smart, patient. The best plans take months to execute. Moses showed him how to read patrol patterns, how to predict when dogs would be rotated, how to identify which overseers were heavy drinkers and which stayed alert. And you need to be absolutely ruthless when necessary. That lesson came faster than Ezekiel expected. His first mission was to extract a family, a mother, father, and 2 young children from a plantation 15 miles east. The father, a man named Samuel, had made contact through the network. His wife was pregnant with their 3rd child, and he'd seen too many babies sold away. They were ready to risk everything. Ezekiel and Moses approached the plantation on a moonless night. The plan was simple. Meet the family at a pre-arranged location, guide them to the first safe house, then disappear before dawn. Simple, but not easy. They waited at the designated spot, an abandoned tobacco barn at the property's edge. Samuel appeared first, his wife Sarah clutching their children, but something was wrong. Ezekiel saw it immediately in Samuel's eyes, the terror, the apology. "I'm sorry," Samuel whispered. "They made me." The ambush came from 3 sides. 5 armed men, led by a notorious slave catcher named Cyrus Webb. Webb was famous throughout Virginia for his cruelty and his success rate. He never returned empty-handed, and he never brought back his captures in good condition. "Well, well," Webb drawled, his rifle pointed at Moses. "2 for the price of 1, and Moses himself. The bounty on you could buy me a nice piece of land." Ezekiel's mind raced. They were surrounded, outgunned, and Samuel's family stood exposed in the middle of it all. This was the moment Moses had warned him about, the moment when mercy became a luxury they couldn't afford. "Samuel, take your family and run," Ezekiel said quietly. "Due west, don't stop." "They're not going anywhere," Webb said, but his attention was on Moses and Ezekiel, the real prizes. What happened next became the first story that would cement Ezekiel's reputation. He moved like thunder. His massive frame crashed into the nearest hunter before the man could fire, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the air. Moses, trained and ready, took advantage of the chaos to disarm another. But it was what Ezekiel did to Webb that people would remember. The slave catcher turned his rifle, finger on the trigger, aimed at Sarah and her children. Ezekiel covered the distance in 3 strides. His hands found Webb's throat, and in that moment he made a choice, the choice Moses had said he'd have to make. He didn't hesitate, he didn't show mercy. Webb dropped, and the message was clear. Anyone who threatened the people Ezekiel was protecting would face the same fate. The remaining hunters fled into the darkness, their courage evaporating. Samuel stood frozen, his family clutching him. You killed him." "Yes." Ezekiel's voice was flat, emotionless. And I'll kill anyone else who tries to stop you from being free. Now run west. Follow the creek until you find the marked oak. Someone will be waiting." As the family disappeared into the night, Moses placed a hand on Ezekiel's shoulder. "You understand now. This is what it takes. I understand." And he did. There would be no half measures, no compromises. Every person they saved was a person worth fighting for, worth killing for. Word of that night spread fast. The story grew with each telling, how a giant of a man had killed Cyrus Webb with his bare hands, how he'd faced down 5 armed men without fear, how he'd saved an entire family from certain death or worse. Plantation owners began to worry, overseers started looking over their shoulders, and enslaved people throughout Virginia began to whisper a new name, Ezekiel, the brutal savior. Over the following months, Ezekiel perfected his craft. He learned the old African fighting techniques Moses taught him, combined with the raw violence he'd developed through years of survival. He became a ghost, appearing at plantations in the dead of night, extracting the desperate and the brave, and vanishing before anyone could respond. But he also learned the subtler skills, how to gather intelligence, how to identify who was ready to run and who wasn't, how to spot informants and traitors. The network expanded with Ezekiel at its center, a force of nature that seemed unstoppable. He developed a system. Each plantation had eyes, enslaved people who watched, listened, and passed information. They identified those who wanted to escape, assessed the security, and sent word through the network. Ezekiel would plan for weeks, sometimes months, before making a move. And when he did move, it was surgical in its precision and devastating in its effectiveness. The count began to rise. 5 people freed, then 10, then 20. Each success made the next operation slightly easier, as fear among the slave catchers grew and hope among the enslaved strengthened. But success bred attention. The plantation owners formed a coalition, pooling resources to stop what they were calling the underground ghost. They brought in trackers from as far as South Carolina, men who specialized in hunting human prey. They offered bounties that grew larger with each passing month. Ezekiel's response was simple. He became more brutal, more efficient, more fearless. Every hunter who came close either fled or never returned. His reputation grew from feared to legendary. Enslaved people across Virginia knew his name and prayed for his arrival. White slaveholders spoke it in tones usually reserved for biblical plagues. One night, rescuing a group of 12 from a plantation in the western counties, Ezekiel encountered a young woman named Grace. She was barely 20, but her eyes held the weight of decades. She'd been separated from her husband, sold to a different plantation, and she'd heard through the network that Ezekiel could help. "They say you're death itself," she told him as they moved through the forest. "They say you kill without hesitation." "Only those who need killing," Ezekiel replied. "And after we're free, what becomes of you?" It was a question he hadn't allowed himself to consider. What did become of a man who'd turned himself into a weapon? Could there be a life after violence, after so much blood? "That's not for me to know," he finally said. "My purpose is clear. Get people to freedom. Everything else is extra." Grace nodded, but her eyes suggested she understood something Ezekiel himself hadn't fully grasped, that he'd sacrificed any chance of a normal life the moment he chose this path. He was committed now, body and soul, to a cause that would likely consume him. By the end of his first year working with the network, Ezekiel had personally freed over 100 people. Each one represented a story, a life reclaimed, a small victory against a monstrous system. He kept no record, spoke no names, left no trace beyond the empty slave quarters and the frustrated plantation owners. But the cost was mounting. Several safe house operators had been discovered and killed. 2 members of the network had been captured and tortured for information they died without revealing. And Ezekiel himself was being hunted by an ever-growing force of determined, well-paid professionals. Moses pulled him aside one evening at one of the swamp settlements. "You're pushing too hard, too fast. The heat's getting dangerous. There are more people waiting, more families to save. And if you're caught, all of this ends. You're becoming the whole network in people's minds. That's dangerous." Ezekiel understood the warning, but he couldn't stop. Every night he didn't act was another night someone suffered in chains. Every delay meant another family torn apart, another spirit broken. "Then I'll just have to not get caught," he said simply. Moses shook his head but smiled slightly. "You're either the bravest man I've ever met or the craziest. Maybe both." As Ezekiel prepared for his next operation, the liberation of 23 people from one of the largest plantations in the region, he reflected on how far he'd come. He was no longer the man who'd stood in those quarters watching the sunrise. He'd become something else entirely. The planters called him brutal. They called him a murderer, a devil, a force of pure destruction. And they were right. But they couldn't see the other side. The families he'd reunited, the children he'd carried through swamps, the hope he'd sparked in hundreds of desperate hearts. If this story is gripping you, go ahead and leave your like and follow the channel so you don't miss anything from this adventure. By the spring of 1705, Ezekiel had become Virginia's most wanted man. The bounty on his head had reached unprecedented levels. £500, a fortune that could set a man up for life. But money couldn't buy what the plantation owners really wanted: proof that this ghost could bleed, that he wasn't some supernatural force, but flesh and blood that could be broken. Edmund Hartwell, whose plantation Ezekiel had escaped from, took the campaign personally. He'd lost 43 slaves in 18 months, an economic disaster that threatened his entire operation. More than the money, though, Hartwell's pride couldn't bear it. A slave from his own quarters had become the instrument of his humiliation. "I want him alive," Hartwell told the assembled group of slave catchers and mercenaries he'd hired. "I want every slave in Virginia to watch what happens when you cross the natural order. I want his death to last days." Leading this new hunting party was a man named Jeremiah Stone, a former British military officer who'd made a career of tracking deserters and criminals. Stone was different from the usual thugs who hunted escaped slaves. He was methodical, patient, and coldly intelligent. "He's good," Stone told Hartwell after studying Ezekiel's pattern of operations. "Better than good. He thinks like a soldier, but every soldier has weaknesses, and his is predictable. He can't resist a large group in need." Stone's plan was elegant in its cruelty. They would create a trap disguised as an opportunity, a plantation where security was mysteriously lax, where a large group of slaves was planning an escape, where information would flow through the network like honey. And when Ezekiel came to help, they'd be waiting. But Stone hadn't counted on the network's sophistication or the loyalty Ezekiel had inspired. Word of the trap reached Moses through 3 different sources, all confirming the same thing. Something was wrong at the Woodbridge plantation. The pieces fit too perfectly, the timing too convenient. "It's obvious," Moses told Ezekiel when they met in the swamp. "They're trying to bait you." "I know," Moses blinked. "You know? And you're still considering it?" "There are real people at that plantation. Mixed in with Stone's trap, there are actual families who need help. I've seen the names, heard their stories through the network. We can't abandon them just because it's dangerous." "It's not just dangerous, it's suicide." Ezekiel was quiet for a moment, watching the moonlight play across the dark water. "How many have we saved so far?" "You personally, nearly 300. The network as a whole, over 1,000 in the past 2 years. And how many are still in chains? How many are suffering right now while we debate risks?" Ezekiel turned to Moses. "You taught me that every mission requires risk. This one just requires more. There's risk, and then there's walking into hell with your eyes open. Then I'll walk into hell, but I won't walk alone." Ezekiel's voice took on a tone Moses had learned to recognize: absolute conviction. "Gather the most experienced people in the network. Not the whole group, just those willing to take the highest risk. We're going to use Stone's trap against him. What followed was 2 weeks of intensive planning, the most complex operation the network had ever attempted. Ezekiel studied everything about the Woodbridge plantation: guard rotations, building layouts, escape routes, weather patterns. He identified which slaves at the plantation were genuinely seeking freedom and which might be compromised. He planned for every contingency he could imagine, and several more besides. The key was misdirection. Stone expected Ezekiel to come quietly in the night, following his usual pattern. Instead, Ezekiel would arrive in the chaos of a storm, with multiple teams creating diversions across the plantation's extensive grounds. The night of the operation, thunder rolled across Virginia like artillery fire. Rain fell in sheets, reducing visibility to mere feet. Ezekiel led a team of 7, all experienced, all deadly serious about the stakes. "Remember," he told them before they split up, "the real people we're saving are in the northern quarters. Everything else is misdirection. Get them out, get them to the rally point, and don't engage unless you have to." The plantation was larger than most, sprawling across hundreds of acres. Stone had positioned his men carefully, 20 armed hunters concealed throughout the grounds. But he'd made one critical mistake. He'd assumed Ezekiel would act like a criminal, sneaking and hiding. Instead, Ezekiel came like a storm. The first diversion hit the southern stable. Fire, carefully controlled but dramatic, lit up the night sky. Guards rushed toward it, leaving gaps in their coverage. The second diversion came from the east, where 2 network members created enough noise to suggest a major breach. Stone recognized the tactic immediately. "It's a diversion. Hold your positions in the north." But Ezekiel had anticipated that too. While Stone's men focused on holding the northern quarters, Ezekiel and his primary team were already inside the main house, specifically the cellar where Stone had set up his command post. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Stone reached for his pistol, but Ezekiel's hand clamped around his wrist with crushing force. "You made a mistake," Ezekiel said quietly. "You thought this was about me. It was never about me." "You're a dead man," Stone hissed. "They'll hunt you forever. Let them hunt." Ezekiel's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "Every day they hunt me is another day people go free. Every resource they spend on me is a resource not spent on catching families." He released Stone but destroyed the man's carefully organized maps and intelligence. 2 years of work ruined in minutes. Then, as sirens and shouts filled the air, Ezekiel's team executed the real plan. The families in the northern quarters, 17 people total, including children too young to walk, were evacuated through a route no one had seen coming, directly through the main house, under the cover of chaos, and out through the formal gardens that bordered the property. By the time Stone's men regrouped and realized what had happened, the group was already miles away, scattered into 3 separate parties following different routes to safety. But the night wasn't over. As Ezekiel's group moved through the forest, they encountered a patrol, 6 mounted men with dogs. This was the moment the old Ezekiel, the one who'd first started this journey, would have hesitated. But the new Ezekiel, forged by 2 years of brutal necessity, didn't even slow down. The fight was vicious. The dogs went down first, a terrible necessity that Ezekiel hated but couldn't avoid. Then the riders, unhorsed and terrified, faced a man who fought like something beyond human. When it was over, 3 were dead, and the other 3 fled into the night, carrying tales of a giant who fought with the fury of righteous anger. Grace, the young woman from a previous rescue who'd joined the network as a guide, witnessed the entire thing. As they regrouped afterward, she approached Ezekiel. "You're hurt," she said, pointing to a gash on his arm. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing. None of this is nothing." Her eyes held his. "How long can you keep doing this? How long before they get lucky?" Ezekiel cleaned the wound as they walked. "As long as it takes." "And what happens to the network when you're gone? You've become its heart, Ezekiel. If you fall..." Then someone else will rise. That's the thing they don't understand. He gestured to the families they were protecting, moving silently through the darkness. This isn't about one man. It's bigger than me, bigger than any of us. The network existed before me, and it'll exist after. But will it be as effective? That was the question he couldn't answer. Over the following months, as his count of freed slaves climbed past 500, Ezekiel began to think seriously about succession. He trained others in his methods, shared his intelligence, tried to decentralize the operations. But his reputation had become a double-edged sword. It inspired hope and paralyzed the opposition. But it also made him irreplaceable in people's minds. The breaking point came in late summer. Ezekiel learned through the network that his sister, the one he'd thought lost forever, sold south years ago, was alive. She was being held at a plantation in North Carolina, pregnant and scheduled to be sold again after giving birth. Moses immediately saw the danger. It's too convenient. After all this time, suddenly word appears about your sister. They're using her as bait. I know. Then you know you can't go. Ezekiel looked at his friend, this man who'd taught him everything, who'd turned him from a broken slave into a liberator. If I can't go for my own family, what does that say about everything we've done? It says you're human, and humans have to make impossible choices to survive. Then I choose to be more than human. Ezekiel's voice was quiet, but immovable. I choose to be what they need me to be, even if it costs me everything. The operation to rescue his sister would be the most dangerous yet. It would require traveling across state lines into territory where his network's reach was limited. It would mean walking into an obvious trap. But for Ezekiel, there was no choice. As he prepared for what might be his final mission, he gathered the core members of the network, 20 people who'd risked everything over the past 2 years. Whatever happens, he told them, the work continues. Every person in chains deserves freedom. Every family deserves to stay together. That's not my mission. It's our mission. I'm just the one willing to be the monster they fear. Grace stepped forward. Then we'll be monsters with you. Others nodded. And Ezekiel realized that in trying to become a weapon, he'd actually built something greater, a movement. People throughout Virginia and beyond now understood that resistance was possible, that the system of slavery wasn't as unbreakable as it appeared, that hope was a weapon as powerful as fear. And if you want to keep discovering what happens, don't forget to like and activate the channel's notification bell so you can follow the final chapters. The journey to North Carolina took 6 days of hard traveling through territory that grew increasingly hostile with each mile. Ezekiel moved with a small team, Moses, Grace, and 3 others from the network's most experienced operators. They traveled mostly at night, avoiding roads and settlements, living like ghosts in the margins of the colonial world. The plantation where his sister was supposedly held belonged to a man named Nathaniel Crow, whose reputation for cruelty made Edmund Hartwell look merciful by comparison. Crow specialized in breaking slaves he considered rebellious, and his methods were legendary for their brutality. The fact that Ezekiel's sister had ended up there suggested this was indeed an elaborate trap. Last chance to turn back, Moses said, as they observed the plantation from a distant hillside. We can still save other people. We don't have to walk into this. Ezekiel studied the layout through the twilight. The plantation was massive. Over 300 slaves worked these fields. Guards patrolled in patterns that were almost military in their precision. And somewhere in that sprawling complex of buildings, if the intelligence was correct, was Sarah, his sister, now a woman of 25, carrying a child and facing sail to an even worse fate. I see her, Grace whispered, pointing to a group of women being led from the fields. Even at this distance, even after so many years, Ezekiel recognized his sister's walk, the way she held her shoulders despite the weight of everything she carried. It's really her. His voice caught. The first time in years anyone had heard genuine emotion crack his usual iron control. She's alive. That night, They infiltrated the plantation's perimeter, not to rescue Sarah immediately, but to gather intelligence. What they discovered confirmed their worst fears. The entire plantation was a trap, elaborately constructed over months. Crow had indeed acquired Sarah, but only after making a deal with Hartwell and Stone. They'd known Ezekiel would come if they found his sister, but they'd also made a critical error. In focusing all their attention on capturing Ezekiel, they'd neglected to secure the plantation properly against a larger operation. They expected one man, maybe a small team. They didn't expect what Ezekiel had actually brought, a coordinated assault involving nearly 40 members of the network, converging from multiple states. "This is bigger than just rescuing Sarah," Ezekiel told the assembled group 2 nights before the planned operation. "This is our chance to break one of the worst operations in the South. Crow has 300 people in bondage here. We can't free them all in one night, but we can free enough to break his power. We can show every slave in the Carolinas that resistance works." The plan was audacious to the point of madness. Multiple diversionary attacks across the plantation's vast grounds. Simultaneous destruction of key infrastructure, not to burn the place down, but to create chaos and confusion. Teams assigned to specific objectives. The northern quarters where Sarah was held, the punishment cells where Crow kept those he was breaking, the stables where horses and supplies could be seized. But the heart of the plan was Ezekiel himself. He would draw out Crow, Stone, and the main force of hunters, giving the others time to operate. He would become the monster they expected, the demon they'd prepared for, and in doing so, make himself the ultimate distraction. The night of the operation, as teams moved into position, Grace pulled Ezekiel aside. "You're planning something you're not telling us. The plan is solid. The plan puts you in the most danger. You're making yourself the primary target." Ezekiel didn't deny it. "Someone has to hold their attention long enough for everyone else to get clear. I'm the one they want. I'm the one whose capture would justify all their resources. So I'll give them what they want, or make them think they're getting it. And then I'll do what I've always done. Survive, adapt, win." Grace studied his face in the moonlight. "You've changed, you know, from the man Moses first brought to the network. You're harder now, colder. That's what the work requires. But what does it do to you? What happens when the war is over?" Ezekiel had no answer for that. He'd stopped thinking about a future beyond the next mission, the next rescue, the next confrontation. His life had narrowed to a single purpose, and everything else, dreams, hopes, the possibility of peace, had fallen away. The attack began at midnight, synchronized across the plantation. Fire, controlled but dramatic, erupted from the southern warehouses. An explosion rocked the eastern checkpoint, destroying it completely. From the west came the sound of gunfire as a team engaged the patrol there. And from the north came Ezekiel. He didn't hide, didn't sneak. He walked directly through the main gates, a massive figure in the firelight, and his voice carried across the compound. "I'm here for my sister. Send her out, and I'll leave peacefully. Keep her, and I'll tear this place apart brick by brick." It was pure theater designed to focus every eye, every gun, every hunter on him, and it worked perfectly. Crow himself appeared on the main house's balcony, Stone beside him, surrounded by armed men. "The infamous Ezekiel," Crow called out. "You're either the bravest man alive or the stupidest. I'm a man who keeps his promises. Sarah walks free, or none of you see sunrise." Bold words for someone surrounded by 50 armed men. Crow gestured, and hunters emerged from buildings all around the compound, exactly as Ezekiel had expected. "You've finally made the mistake we've been waiting for. You've let emotion cloud your judgment." Maybe. Ezekiel's hand moved to his belt, where he carried the tools of his trade. Not weapons in the traditional sense, but implements he'd learned to use with devastating effectiveness. Or maybe I'm exactly where I need to be. What followed was chaos on a scale Virginia had never seen. As the hunters closed in on Ezekiel, the rest of the network struck across the plantation. Teams breached the quarters, freeing not just Sarah, but dozens of others. The punishment cells were opened, releasing slaves Crow had been torturing. The stables were raided, horses taken for the escape, and in the center of it all, Ezekiel fought like something beyond human. He'd spent 2 years becoming a weapon, and now he unleashed everything he'd learned. Hunters fell before him, some dead, others injured badly enough to stop fighting. Stone himself engaged Ezekiel directly, and for a moment, it seemed the two might be evenly matched. "You can't win this," Stone gasped as they grappled. "Even if you escape tonight, we'll keep coming. We'll never stop." "Then I'll never stop either." Ezekiel's voice was granite. "Every day you chase me is another day families go free. You think you're hunting me? I'm hunting you. Hunting every slave catcher, every cruel overseer, every plantation owner who thinks human beings are property, and I'm winning." The fight ended with Stone unconscious, and Ezekiel moved toward the main house where Crow had retreated. But he stopped when he saw Sarah emerging from the quarters, supported by 2 network members. Even across the chaos of the compound, their eyes met, and recognition blazed between them. She was real. She was alive. And she was free. That moment of distraction nearly cost Ezekiel his life. A shot rang out, Crow firing from the balcony. The bullet grazed Ezekiel's shoulder, spinning him around. More shots followed as the plantation owner emptied his pistol in fury and fear, but Grace was there, her own weapon drawn, returning fire that drove Crow back inside. "We have to go." The plan was always to get out before reinforcements arrive. Ezekiel knew she was right. Already they'd been at the plantation nearly an hour. Patrols from neighboring plantations would be converging. They'd accomplished the objective. More than the objective. Over 120 people were being evacuated through multiple routes. The plantation's infrastructure was in ruins, and Sarah was safe. As they retreated into the forest, the freed slaves moving in organized groups toward predetermined safe houses, Ezekiel finally reached his sister. She stared at him in wonder, this giant of a man who was somehow her brother. "Ezekiel, they told me you were dead years ago." "I was." His voice was rough with emotion. "And then I came back. They had no time for reunion, not yet." The night was far from over, and danger still stalked every step. But as they moved through the darkness, Ezekiel felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope, not just for the people he'd freed, but for himself. Maybe, just maybe, there could be something beyond the violence. Maybe the weapon could become a man again. But that hope was tested as dawn approached. A massive patrol had assembled. Over 100 armed men, dogs, and tracking equipment. The largest manhunt in Virginia history was about to unfold, and Ezekiel was at its center. Moses made the decision everyone knew was coming. "We have to split up. The large group draws too much attention. Small parties, different routes, different timings. And Sarah?" Ezekiel looked at his sister, who was clearly exhausted, the pregnancy making travel difficult. "I'll take her," Grace volunteered. "With 2 others. We'll move slow but careful. You need to draw the hunt away from us." It was the logical plan, but it meant separating from his sister immediately after finding her. Sarah gripped his hand. "Promise me we'll see each other again, in a place where we're both free." "I promise." And Ezekiel meant it, even as he knew the odds against that promise coming true. As the groups dispersed into the pre-dawn darkness, Ezekiel found himself with Moses and 3 others, deliberately leaving an obvious trail. They were the bait now, drawing the massive manhunt away from the 100+ people trying to reach safety. "You know they're going to catch up eventually," Moses said as they ran through the forest. "We can't outrun this forever." "We don't have to run forever. Just long enough." But even Ezekiel was beginning to feel the weight of it all. 2 years of constant action, constant danger, constant violence. His body bore dozens of scars from close calls and direct confrontations. His mind carried the weight of every decision, every life saved, and every life taken to protect those he was saving. As the sun rose, painting the forest in shades of gold and green, they could hear the hunt behind them. Dogs baying, men shouting, the sound of an entire system mobilized to stop one man and what he represented. If you're curious about the outcome of this story, don't forget to like and activate the channel's bell to follow the final chapter. The hunt lasted 3 weeks, a desperate game of cat and mouse across Virginia and into Maryland. Ezekiel and his small team used every trick they'd learned, every safe house in the network, every advantage the wilderness could provide. But the sheer scale of the operation against them was unprecedented. Slave catchers from 4 colonies had converged, along with colonial militias and hired mercenaries. They finally made their stand at the edge of the Great Dismal Swamp, the place where Ezekiel's education had begun. Moses had been wounded 2 days earlier, a musket ball that had grazed his leg, slowing him down. The other 3 members of their party had split off days before to create diversions. "This is it," Moses said as they waded into the familiar murky water. "They'll follow us in, but in here we have the advantage." The swamp communities rallied. Word had spread through the network about what Ezekiel had done at Crow's plantation. Over 120 people freed in a single night, one of the largest rescue operations in the network's history. He'd become more than a man to the enslaved people of Virginia. He'd become a symbol that resistance was possible, that freedom could be seized rather than granted. The final confrontation came 3 days into the swamp. A force of nearly 200 men had assembled at the swamp's edge, led by Hartwell himself, who'd become obsessed with capturing the slave who'd escaped him. But entering the swamp in force was suicide. The terrain favored those who knew it, and Ezekiel knew it better than anyone. The hunters sent in small teams, but they were picked apart by the swamp's defenders, freed slaves who'd made this wilderness their home, network members from across the region who'd converged to protect their most valuable asset. The Great Dismal Swamp became a killing ground for those who thought they could hunt humans with impunity. But the siege couldn't last forever. The swamp communities had limited supplies, and the colonial forces were willing to wait them out. Starvation would do what bullets couldn't. It was then that Ezekiel made a decision that would cement his legend. On the 10th day of the siege, he walked out of the swamp alone, directly toward the assembled forces. His massive frame emerged from the mist like something from a nightmare, and 200 men found themselves frozen, unsure what to do. "I'm Ezekiel," his voice carried across the water. "The man you've been hunting. I'm here to make a deal." Hartwell stepped forward, his face a mask of rage and triumph. "You're in no position to make deals." "I'm in the only position that matters." Ezekiel gestured back toward the swamp. "You can spend months trying to starve us out, losing men every day to defenders you can't see, or you can have me. We'll have you and everyone else in there." "No." Ezekiel's voice was iron. "You'll have me, and you'll let the network continue its work. You'll pull back your forces, and I'll surrender." The gathered hunters erupted in confusion. Stone, still nursing injuries from their previous fight, pushed forward. "Why would we agree to that? Because I'm what you really want. I'm the one you've spent fortunes chasing. I'm the one whose capture would justify all this effort." Ezekiel's eyes swept across the assembly. "And because if you don't agree, I'll disappear back into that swamp, and this will continue for years. You'll never know peace. You'll never sleep easy. Every time a slave disappears, you'll wonder if I helped them." It was a brilliant gambit, offering them the victory they needed while ensuring the network's survival. But Moses, watching from the swamp's edge, understood what it really meant. Ezekiel was sacrificing himself, trading his life for the continuation of the cause. Hartwell seemed to sense it too. And why should we believe you'll honor this deal? Because I've never broken my word. Ask anyone who's worked with me. When I make a promise, I keep it. Ezekiel stepped closer, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. You want me? Here I am. But the network continues. The work continues. Freedom continues. The debate among the hunters lasted an hour. Some wanted to reject the deal and push into the swamp regardless. Others recognized the strategic value. Having Ezekiel as a prize, making an example of him, would send its own message. Finally, Hartwell agreed, though his eyes promised that Ezekiel's capture would only be the beginning of his suffering. The betrayal came from an unexpected source. As Ezekiel was being bound with chains, heavy iron that took 3 men to carry, Grace emerged from the swamp with 20 armed network members. "No," she said simply, "we're not accepting this deal." "Grace, stand down," Ezekiel ordered. "Stand down? You're sacrificing yourself for us. That's not how this works." She turned to the assembled hunters. "You want to take him? You'll have to go through all of us." More figures emerged from the swamp. 30, 40, 50 freed slaves, all armed with whatever they could carry, all willing to fight. The hunters found themselves facing an armed uprising, something they'd never anticipated. Hartwell's hand went to his pistol. "You're all going to die. Maybe." Grace's voice was steady. "But so will most of you. Is it worth it? Is capturing 1 man worth losing half your forces?" It was a standoff that could have ended in a massacre. But then something remarkable happened. From the assembled hunters, several men, hired mercenaries, not plantation owners, began to back away. The arithmetic of survival outweighed the bounty. Facing 50 desperate armed people in terrain that favored defenders wasn't a fight most were willing to have. The standoff broke when Moses fired a single shot, not at the hunters, but into the air. "Last warning, leave now, and this ends peacefully. Stay and we'll fight. Your choice." The hunters wavered, then broke. Most began retreating, and within minutes, the massive force that had assembled to capture Ezekiel was dissolving. Only Hartwell, Stone, and a handful of their most loyal men remained. "This isn't over," Hartwell snarled. "We'll hunt you all to the ends of the earth. You can try." Ezekiel's voice carried absolute conviction. "But every day you hunt us is another day. Families go free. Every resource you spend on revenge is a resource not spent on maintaining your system. We're not hiding anymore. We're not running. We're here, we're organized, and we're not stopping." It was a declaration of war, but one where the terms had fundamentally shifted. The network was no longer underground. It was a visible, viable resistance that had proven it could defend itself. The months that followed transformed the landscape of slavery in Virginia. Ezekiel's stand at the Great Dismal Swamp became legendary, inspiring resistance across the South. The network expanded rapidly, emboldened by the proof that organized resistance could work. Plantations that had been impregnable fortresses found themselves losing slaves in groups, unable to stop the tide. Ezekiel himself settled into a new role. No longer primarily an operative, he became the network's strategic mind, training others, planning operations, coordinating between multiple states. His count of personally freed slaves had reached over 800 by the end of 1706, but the network as a whole had freed thousands. He was reunited with Sarah, who'd safely reached a free settlement in Pennsylvania. She'd given birth to a son, whom she named Ezekiel in honor of her brother. Seeing his sister free, holding her child, a child who would grow up free, gave meaning to every sacrifice he'd made. But the cost was visible. Ezekiel was 30 years old but looked 50. His body bore the scars of countless fights. His movements showed the accumulated damage of years of brutal work. And there was something in his eyes, a hardness that came from doing terrible things for noble reasons, from becoming the monster he'd needed to be. Grace, who'd stayed with the network and become one of its most effective operatives, found him one evening watching the sunset from the edge of a settlement. "How many more?" she asked quietly. How many more what? How many more do we need to free before you can rest? Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. Every single one, but that's not possible in my lifetime, or even in 100 lifetimes. So we do what we can, save who we can, and trust that we're building something that will outlast us. You've saved over 1,000 people, Ezekiel. Personally, the network has saved thousands more because of what you built. At what point is it enough? It's never enough, not while anyone remains in chains. He turned to her. But I understand what you're asking. Yes, I'm tired. Yes, the violence weighs on me. Every person I killed, even those who deserved it, leaves a mark. But tired doesn't mean done. I'll keep going until I can't anymore. And then someone else will rise. That's the beauty of what we've built. It's not about one man anymore. It's a movement, an idea. And ideas are harder to kill than men. In the years that followed, Ezekiel's legend grew beyond the facts. Stories were told of impossible rescues, of supernatural abilities, of a man who couldn't be stopped or killed. Some of them were true, many were exaggerations. But all of them served a purpose. They gave hope to the hopeless and fear to the oppressors. By 1710, Ezekiel had been directly responsible for the freedom of over 1,200 people. The network he'd helped build had freed more than 5,000. Plantation owners across the South had been forced to increase security, which increased costs, which made the entire system less economically viable. The rebellion he'd sparked didn't end slavery. That would take another 150 years and a civil war, but it proved that resistance was possible, that the enslaved were not powerless. The final chapter of Ezekiel's active career came in 1712, when a coordinated series of operations freed over 300 people in a single week across 3 colonies. It was the pinnacle of the network's capabilities, the culmination of everything he'd built. But it also attracted attention that couldn't be ignored. Colonial authorities, embarrassed by their inability to stop the resistance, began to crack down with unprecedented violence. Safe houses were raided, network members captured and executed publicly, entire communities punished for harboring runaways. Ezekiel understood that his continued presence was becoming a liability. His legend was so large that it drew focus and resources that might otherwise be directed at the actual work of freedom. So he made a decision that surprised everyone. He would disappear. Not die, he told Moses and the core leadership, but disappear. Let the legend continue without the man. Let people wonder if I'm still out there, still operating. The fear and hope my name creates is more valuable than my actual presence. It was a painful decision, but strategically sound. In the spring of 1713, after one final operation that freed a group of children scheduled to be sold south, Ezekiel walked into the great dismal swamp and didn't come out. Some said he died there, his body claimed by the wilderness that had sheltered him. Others insisted they saw him years later, still working in secret, still freeing people. The truth was simpler. He'd found a small community deep in the swamp, far from any colonial presence, and there he finally rested. Not in death, but in peace. As much peace as a man who'd done what he'd done could find. In that community, he was just a man again. Not a legend, not a symbol, but Ezekiel, a man who'd survived hell, who'd turned his pain into purpose, and who'd proven that even the most brutal system could be resisted. He lived another 20 years in that swamp community, teaching the young, sharing his knowledge, and occasionally, when necessary, helping with operations that needed his specific expertise. He saw his sister again, met his nephew, and finally allowed himself to imagine a future beyond violence. When he died in 1733, at the age of 58, his body was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the swamp, but his legacy lived on. The network he'd helped build continued its work for decades, evolving and adapting, eventually connecting with the larger abolitionist movement that would help end slavery. The stories of Ezekiel, the brutal slave who spared no one but saved over 1,000, became part of the oral tradition of freed slaves. Parents told their children about the giant who'd fought for freedom. Those children told their children, and through generations, the legend survived, a reminder that resistance was possible, that one person's courage could change the course of history. He was called brutal because he was willing to do what others wouldn't, to fight with absolute conviction, to make the hard choices, to become the weapon his people needed. But those who truly knew him understood. His brutality was never cruelty for its own sake. It was the calculated violence of a man who refused to accept that human beings could be property, who understood that some systems can only be destroyed, not reformed. In the end, Ezekiel's legacy wasn't just the lives he saved, though each of those 200 people represented a story, a family reunited, a future reclaimed. His legacy was the proof he provided that the enslaved were not powerless, that resistance was possible, that courage and conviction could challenge even the most entrenched evil. The brutal savior of Virginia became a legend precisely because he refused to be anything less than what the moment demanded. He transformed himself from a victim into a weapon, from a slave into a liberator, from a man into a symbol of hope that would echo through history. And in settlements across the South for generations to come, when darkness fell and hope seemed lost, people would whisper his name, Ezekiel, and remember that freedom was worth fighting for, that resistance was possible, and that sometimes the most brutal thing you can do is refuse to accept injustice. If this story moved you, leave your like and follow the channel for more incredible stories from history, mysteries, and hidden secrets that you'll only find here.